This is Blueies and Shoeies capping off the fourth week of the Rugby Championship. I'll touch very briefly on the Wallabies' embarrassing loss against the Los Pumas and South Africa beating for the fourth time in a row and finally reclaiming the Freedom Cup off the All Blacks and on the cusp of victory for the Rugby Championship. Really quickly, for disheartened, embarrassed Wallaby fans, having ultimately been given the first test after what could only be described as schoolboy mistake in that first test, at least in terms of the ending and the close shutting out of the game by Argentina. They did come back from 10 points down, I'll give them credit, but being 20-3 up after 30 minutes and then conceding the next 50 minutes of the game 64-7. 64 what would have been 50 minutes for Argentina. Argentina are not a razzle-dazzle, score lots of points kind of team. You know, their DNA is forward-dominated rugby. They used to have a lot better scrums than they have today. They like to take the game to the trenches, where they can then, certainly they like to make the breakdowns quite messy. That's typically how they like to play. Don't get me wrong, they have had some very talented backs over the years, but by no means have they had the scoring ability of a comparable team in terms of talent and putting 61 points in 50 minutes against that team. I've only seen some of the highlights. I've got to analyse the game in a little bit more detail, but from what I could gather and what you take from two comparable teams and one team absolutely dominating for 50 minutes stretch is the Wallaby players must have downed tools. Some of the lack of effort, lack of intensity. You can't tell me it's lack of know-how in defence for the Wallabies is embarrassing. And as South African fans, you know, we often look at ourselves and really find the reason why. Why do you do this outside of your love of rugby or your love of the game? You do it for your family. You do it for your loved ones. You do it for self-pride. But right up there with all of those is you do it for South Africa and trying to make South Africa proud, try to take the hard moments, the hard pressures of life that average South Africans go through, and you try for 80 minutes to bring them some joy, make their weekend. And look, Joe Smith is a understated chap. He certainly doesn't come out like a bit of a bulldozer in terms of his personality. I'm sure behind closed doors he might have a bit of a bite. But the one thing he does do is he holds his teams accountable. He has high standards. So it should be really interesting to see what happens against the All Blacks in the Bledisloe. The All Blacks should win that 2-0. Those two tests, both home and away. But are we going to see a rejuvenated Australia, fired up Australia, trying to win back some support? Because really, after a result like that, fans can take a loss. They can take a loss. They can take a bad loss when you're 17 points up against a team, and that team just blows the hinges off and plays great, and they beat you by 5 points. Going to come back. But to concede the volume of tries over such a short space of time is embarrassing. Now, moving back to the Springbok New Zealand game. In terms of South Africa, start once again was soft in the fact that the ball was properly taken. We saw Colby end up on the wrong side of the ruck in the first test, which gave the impetus to New Zealand for that first 10-15 minutes of the first half. Fortunately, we only conceded one try, but we did lose a man for 10 minutes. This week, Grant Williams didn't get the ball out quick enough. It's good to see those rules being implemented, but would be good for us just to tidy up some really weak mistakes starting up front, receiving the ball, setting the foundation, start as you mean to go on, and laying that foundation, whether it is running the ball out or kicking for touch and setting the game plan from there, and not inviting pressure through silly mistakes. South Africa's line-out still is a lot to be desired. Dwight last week in particular spoke about the lack of variations. The options that we're going for were typically areas within the line-out that could be contested. I think we did see a little bit more variation, but whether it was just an off day for Bongi or whether it was just a half a second out where balls delivered, players on jumping just at the time. The South African line-out was messy, and again, that will be something that they'll seriously need to look at. Dwight mentioned last week that South Africa were third, I believe, out of the 4 teams in terms of line-out, and I think scrums were involved at the time. I think certainly we had a much better scrumming performance this week in Cape Town. Saw a much more dominant performance in the scrums. Don't get me wrong, I don't think we overawed the All Blacks, but we definitely edged that battle. But the line-outs are the issue, and seriously, if we're third in the rankings of 14, 2 of which are pretty average, let's be honest, then there's still some work to do in that regard. Canan Moodie was disappointing in the fact that he really struggled to get into the game. That can happen at wing, but I just thought some of his situational awareness had a lot to be desired at times. He wasn't awful, but I think he really just struggled to impact the game. You think of that crossfield kick by Handré Pollard, fair enough, Will Jordan secures the ball in the air, but I just don't think Canan Moodie read the player and the ball at all, and that really sort of summed up his game. He has been out for a while, so if the Springboks can win when 1 or 2 players are really sort of underperforming or really not at the races on the day, that's a positive. And what I'd hope is that we see a lot more of Canan in the Argentina series. You know, the Blues had won the Super Rugby Championship this past year, playing a much more South African mould of rugby. Big boys up front, heavy hitters, more forward-dominated rugby, unlike most of the typical Kiwi teams. And we haven't quite seen that translate to what ended up on the pitch in All Black colours. If a team has dominated a competition and ultimately won it, and the other teams have struggled against that style, those warning signs should have been there for both Razor and the coaching staff. Again, was there any background rift between Leon McDonald and Razor around that type of strategy? I'm only speculating. But if a team and a style of rugby had won the Super Rugby Championship, don't necessarily have to adopt Blues rugby, but I would guess that you'd incorporate more of their players. So it should be interesting to see if there's a bit of a change-up in the next 2 tests against Australia. Equally, I think certainly if Richie Mwanga comes back, he'll be starting fly half. I think his stock has really only gone up while he's been in Japan and not being able to be selected. Damien McKenzie is looking more comfortable in the 10 saddle. You know, I wouldn't say green shoot, but I certainly think he's a better 15 and impact player off the bench. Having the ability to not try to fit all your best players in the team and being willing, able, and having the courage to make some tough decisions. We saw Beauden Barrett come off the bench. Whilst he wasn't able to impact the game as he has done many times before off the bench, that is a good sign, at least that we're seeing a tough decision be made. And on that 15 jersey, Will Jordan 4th game against Springboks. I know they're all losses over the last 4 games, but for a chap who has an unbelievable scoring record since his entry into Test rugby, near enough a try a game, fairly close to it, he's been anonymous in the thrashing at Twickenham, the Rugby World Cup final, and these last 2 tests, been very quiet. So for a player that has the world-class ability, that has the X factor. We saw what he did at the World Cup overall. To have 4 games on the bounce, does Rusty and the coaching staff have his number in terms of a plan or a game set for him? Or why is he struggling against South Africa? Be great to hear anyone's comments on those particular reasons, or if anyone else maybe feels that criticism is a little bit unfair. But I'm not sure what you guys think in terms of why Will Jordan seems to really have flashes of brilliance in every test. 4 on the bounce now has really struggled against South Africa. Centre pairing just doesn't work. That's a fact and needs to be changed. I am all for giving a partnership its due course, not making a call after 2, 3 or 4 tests even. Well, we're talking about 3 or 4 years now, and there's been a handful of games, 3 or 4 games where I can remember there was great connection between the two. Individually, they're both really good footballers, athletic, strong, great ball skills, but that combination is just not quite there. And so whether it's introducing Leonard Brown from the start, or bringing up someone out of the talent pool, out of All Black Rugby, I think that's really going to be somewhere where they really need to try and find settled partnership to again build consistency in performance. The limited positives for New Zealand out of this test will certainly be Walter Satiti's first 40, ball in hand, the speed, the pace, the athleticism. Certainly that Dwight spoke quite highly about pre-game. He certainly showed that in spades in that first 40. I'm not actually trying to remember when he actually went off in the test, but we didn't see much from him in that second half. There's certainly some talent there, and given he's really young, that could be a key component just to, again, in terms of combinations, loose trio. Is Sam Cane going to play longer term? Sevilla being the linchpin, they need to build greater depth and great strength at both lock and in the loose forward combinations. Tupu Vai, I thought, had his best game as an All Black early on in his career. There was, I think, a couple of breakdown steals. He was a pain and a threat at the line out. I thought he really stood up and shone for the All Black. As you can tell, I'm clutching at straws for the All Black. I think, like anything, this will be a tough year for the All Black. They were lucky to get away with both wins against England, albeit a win's a win. You've lost against Argentina again, and now 2 back-to-back losses, albeit against great competition. I will touch on just in a short minute or two where I felt they ultimately lost the game, but really struggling to see great positive signs. On the breakdown, the much criticised, certainly by rival fans, with Jeff Wilson, Mulgmalaina and JK. Prior to the Rugby Championship, were the 14 tests laid out for this year for the All Black. Rugby Championship and a tough call to the Northern Hemisphere. Out of those 14, I think JK had them winning 13, which, as an analyst, at times you've got to step back. As much as you may be patriotic and fan is short for fanatic, you've got to be able to have that ability to stand back and look at things logically. Mills said 9. That sounds about right to me. I think they're going to lose a few more this year. However, I think if they're building the right block, I think Razor will take a lot of learning out of the series against South Africa. Not easy to play 2 tests away, and for them to recalibrate and set the foundations for them to progress moving forward. They will no doubt still be expecting for New Zealand to be the best rugby team on the planet. Now, I mentioned earlier about South Africa's poor start in terms of maybe just giving away silly penalties after the kickoff. In terms of the positives, there are many. The rush defence, and ultimately from there the scramble defence, was absolutely superb. on the weekend. When do you watch a game and New Zealand do not score a try? When? And I think that played a key factor in some of the poor decision-making in the second half. And I'll talk about that in a sec. But the ability to push up faster off the line really put ball players in tough predicaments, and the ability to then scramble and cover was unbelievable. The ability and the experience developed by this group to find ways to win, highly commendable. It is always a great sign when I don't think we've played our very best in either game and are still coming out with wins against the quality of opposition, like the All Blacks. The All Blacks made something like 40-odd more tackles in this game, so again, the wear and tear in that second half would have certainly had an impact as it did in the first test. Making those 20 to 30 to 40 more tackles, I think it was close to 30 in the first test at altitude, to then making 40 more tackles at the Cape Town test, really would have been difficult to hold. Again, the most important minutes of the game, which is the last 20. I know Damien Delande got man of the match, and he played terrific. It is difficult to give a player who only played 56 minutes of this test man of the match, but for me there was a clear man of the match in Cape Town, and that was the great Sia Khaleesi. I thought he was unbelievable. One of the best games I've seen him play. And I'll talk you through just a couple of flash points. There was the early part of the game. Talia had the ball down the left touchline, ran straight into Sia, trying to run over him ultimately, and Sia was able to force the knock-on from Talia, to the instance I spoke about Caden Moodley earlier, where Will Jordan intercepted the cross-field kick by Andre Pollard for Caden Moodley. He then lays a grubber down the line. The ability for Sia to turn and get to that ball first and sort of knock it backwards against a man with a pace and athletic ability like Will Jordan showed his absolute desire in that moment that Will Jordan was not going to score. Line out, poor pass to Sia off the line out, bouncing around his ankles. Again, you would expect it at this level, but this is the All Blacks. Under pressure, defenders running in at you, they could really make a big impact on the play. Tackling Sia so far back from the line out, the ability to remain calm, composed, deliver the flick pass to Colby, who then went on a genius, unbelievable sidestep and a phone booth type run. A pity the pass to Peter Steff didn't go to hand off the deck, similar to last week, what we saw many times. However, again, the pressure on Sia just in that instance to remain calm and composed. He again then in the second half put an absolute belter of a tackle when New Zealand looked like they might be stretching. I touched on a little bit earlier there, the scramble defense. That was a key sign. Big hits on Geordie Barrett on the halfway line in the second half, setting the tone as captain. We're here. We ain't going anywhere. And finally, his try. Malcolm Marx had a huge impact on the game coming on. The ability to read the defense. South Africans brag of their enjoyment in the physicality aspects of the game, rather running through a gap, trying to run straight over you. And Dwight touched on last week how we're seeing small changes of actually running for gaps. And that's exactly what Sia did. He's brilliant and is a real powerful runner with ball in hand, but finding the gap in defence and ultimately getting over there. Being held up by Kubas Visa on the touchline as the final whistle went. Having his fist to the crowd, the joy in Kubas Visa's face, the smile was unbelievable. And again, as classy as always off the pitch in terms of his commentary post-game. The man is an absolute juggernaut. He plays his best in green and gold. And Sia Khaleesi, tip of the cap to you, mate. That was unbelievable. Touched on Malcolm Marx just there. I think he was exceptional coming off the bench. The impact he had on the game was tremendous. His ability to draw in defenders. Sivu Reece made a good tackle on him early in the second half. That ultimately, I think, stopped the try. I think that led to the Earburn falling short, if I'm not mistaken, in terms of scrambling for the touchline. But his ability to suck in defenders because of his athletic ability in such a big frame, being a massive Bismarck fan, I didn't think we would quite see the likes of a Bismarck du Plessis ever again. He was probably the first iteration of a non-specialised fetcher, being brilliant at turning over the ball at the breakdown. And then we've seen Malcolm Marx in back-to-back World Cup make vital plays, winning vital turnovers, setting a record for the Lions in Super Rugby. I think he's the best to ever do it. And I know that might be a bit of a recency bias. I understand you've got Hall of Fame legends of the games in, the Fitzpatrick, John Smith, Keith Wood, and Bismarck, as mentioned earlier. But I don't see a weakness in Malcolm Marx's game. The obvious one earlier on in his career was his line-out throwing. I think that is certainly improved a huge amount. But his ability at the breakdown, his ability with ball in hand, and his athleticism carrying such a big frame, he adds so much to the Springbok. And whilst I do understand there can be a pushback around, well, he doesn't play a full 80 minutes. Yeah, and there is some strength in that argument. But he did early on in Rassie's reign. He has done many times before, and he's always proven his class. The guy is phenomenal. If you think about the 2019 World Cup, Bongi going off early again, as he did the 2023 World Cup. He's managed those long minutes. He's a phenomenal player, and I think he might just be the best ever to do it at that hooker position. Finally, on that point around Bongi and Malcolm, these are a couple of alphas. I think certainly Bongi comes across as that dog, that boy that loves the physicality. He's gonna put pressure on you. Malcolm walks into any team on the planet. And this is a kudos to both men being able to leave their egos, which is quite natural. Certainly when you're an elite athlete, elite rugby player, to leave your ego at the door for the betterment of team and country. And that is a huge sacrifice. And thankfully, those sacrifices have paid off as both those boys have 2 World Cups. It'd be great to hear anyone else's thoughts and views on who might be your best hooker of all time. But certainly I think Malcolm Marx, he's that modern day forward, versatile, athletic, able to get around the pitch with ease, brilliant at the breakdown. I just don't see a weakness in his game. Big crunching tackle. It's Malcolm for me. As I wrap up, I'll sort of alluded to slightly earlier in the podcast, real concerning, and again, I'm not sure I touched on this in the pre-game analysis with Dwight, is lack of opposition in Super Rugby because the Australian teams are weak, because some of the Kiwis, some of the greats play overseas now in Japan and the like. Are they not being stress tested enough in Super Rugby to be able to make the right call in the heat of the moment? Now, there is both the decision and the execution when it comes to these things. So if you think about the second half, 55-metre kick at sea level, Damien McKenzie, come on. I mean, what was the chances of that going over? 5%? So if you are kicking for poles, why is Geordie Barrett not kicking? He's your best long field kicker. And if you don't want Geordie because he hasn't got his kicking boots on for whatever reason, why, with a man advantage, given Billy LaRue was offered the yellow card, why are you not kicking down the line and playing to score a try? When do you ever say the All Blacks did not score a try in a game? So 55 metres, wrong decision, in my view. You then have a really makeable kick, and Damien McKenzie misses. And it really reminds me a lot of what we saw from Beauden Barrett when you consider that first massive win for under Rassie Erasmus's early tenure in New Zealand. Beauden Barrett missed a couple of sitters that day, and he's really been sort of relieved of kicking duty ever since. Damien McKenzie reminds me of a Beauden Barrett quality kicker off the tee. He's just not quite a test level. You know, he's not a Dan Carter, and there probably will likely not be another Dan Carter. But for me, he's several percentage of points down on where you need to be considered as an All Black goal kicker. Now, again, I'm assuming Richie Mwanga will take up those duties when he's eligible to play again. But you've got to be able to execute if you've decided to kick for poles at 55 metres and been the best part of 10 metres short. You've got to execute the easy one. And this happens over 5 minutes during the game, between first kick, second kick, and a couple of minutes later, Jaden Hendrickse does a pop kick over the breakdown for Cheslin Colby to chase. He's shoulder charged by Tyrone Lomax. Billy LaRue's coming on. Tyrone Lomax is going off. South Africa have 15 men. New Zealand have 14, and Malcolm Marx scores in the corner. So again, I don't know if it's Super Rugby. I think it has certainly a big part to play in the discussion. But when do New Zealand, after learning potentially from the mistake made at Ellis Park on the 61st, 62nd minute, not to kick for poles, not to get what would have been 14 odd points ahead, so two converted tries, and that ultimately cost them, given it that may have just been too far a stretch for the Springboks with little time left to then go kicking every time and probably not choosing when is the right time to kick or who is the right kicker. Because if you're going to kick it over, it needs to go over. And I just don't think Damien McKenzie has the length in that regard. And Geordie Barrett was an obvious one. We saw how close he was kicking that one over from just over the halfway line of the World Cup final. So a lot for New Zealand to ponder. I'll probably discuss a little bit about certainly what I would like to see from the Springboks over the next two tests against Argentina. A couple of players that hopefully get a little bit more opportunity to shine. I believe South Africa just need a bonus point over the next two tests. So again, while they want to build consistency in wins and the like, certainly Rafi will be using this as an opportunity, I'm sure, to blood some new players or even starting the likes of an Elric Lowe and giving them game time to really see if they can impact the game from the start. Please like and subscribe. Thank you to everyone for tuning in.